Well, we're in that period now where we are looking forward to the fall holy days. It seems like we're always either looking back to some holy days or we're looking forward to some holy days. In this case, we're looking forward to the fall holy days, and they'll be here probably as fast as we can snap our fingers, it always seems like. We went through the Passover in the spring, and we saw how to observe the Passover. We always proclaim the holy days in their appointed seasons, the moeds as they're called. My Hebrew is not very good, so forgive me for that, but that is generally speaking, the Hebrew word for the appointed times that God instituted. And we came to the Passover. We observed it as our custom has been for many years, and we were told how to do it, and that's how we did it. Then the days of unleavened bread, the same thing. We know how to observe it without leaven in our life, and we know what it represents. It has a beginning and an end. It has the first holy day, and then it has the last holy day, and in between that period, we don't eat anything with leaven in it. We've done that, as I mentioned, for many years, and we'll continue to do that. We know how to observe it. We know the instructions, and we're reminded every year about that. And one of the reasons I say that the fall holy days will be upon us in a snap or a blink of an eye is because during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Sabbath, well, actually it was the first day of unleavened bread, we began to count 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day to Pentecost, and we always think we have plenty of time, but it's here just like that. Then Pentecost came, and we know how to observe it. We know what it represents. We do the same thing with Pentecost. We go to the designated place. We observe Pentecost. We know that it represents God's Spirit, the birth of the church, and other things that it represents. We always talk about those in their due season. First thing we'll be doing, or first thing we know, we'll be talking about the feast of, or the Day of Trumpets, which is a feast and a holy day as well, and what it represents, the return of Jesus Christ, and the other things that it represents and the history of it, and so forth. We know how to observe that. Then probably not the one we most look forward to, but then the Day of Atonement, which we fast and from food and water, not drinking any water or eating any food for a whole 24-hour period, or from sunset the night before to sunset at the end of the day. And we know how to observe that. We observe that in the same customary way that we have many times. We proclaim it. It comes. We read all the scriptures about it, and so on and so forth. Then the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. There again, we know what it represents. We talk about it. We observe it the whole week. Plus an extra day at the end of that, the 8th day, or the last great day, as it's been called for many years. And we observe that. But there is one day that it's not forgotten, it's not ignored, but it is sort of an overlooked holy day. We don't talk about it that much about how to observe it, what to do, and so on, as we do some of the other holy days. Again, it's not ignored, it's not forgotten, but it is sort of sometimes overlooked. And let's turn back to Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, which is a place where all the holy days and all the feasts are listed. They're listed in other places too, individually and some groups of them, and so on. But here in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, they're all listed. They're all talked about. Leviticus 23, and we'll begin with verse 1. It said, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying," now these are God's words, because Moses recorded God's words that he gave him. It says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. And see what he adds here? He doesn't say these are your feasts, these are the Israelites' feasts, these are Jewish feasts. He said these are my feasts. This is God speaking. These are my feasts. It says in verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. The Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord. And that is the day, the holy day, that I want to talk about today, and the observance of it, and how do we keep the Sabbath holy. The title of my message is The Overlooked Holy Day. The Overlooked Holy Day, because we do it so routinely, we do it every week. Sometimes it can become sort of common and ordinary. We look, and it was mentioned in the sermonette, we look so forward to the Feast of Tabernacles and being able to go and celebrate with those of like minds in bigger groups than we normally do on a weekly basis. We look so forward to that. We look so forward to some of the other holy days for getting together with other areas. More people together makes it just so much more special. But the Sabbath day, if we're not careful, can become sort of bland. It can become sort of routine. It becomes sort of ordinary and sort of average to us, because we sometimes don't look at it as one of the holy days. But it is. It's a feast, and it's one of the holy days. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the things, or what we can do, or how we should observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But first, before we do that, let's just take a little glance back at its origin and history and review that just momentarily. It says here that it is 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest. Now, where do we find that history? Where do we find that beginning? Obviously, you know where that would be, and that is in Genesis, the first and second chapter. Genesis chapter 1, it records all the days, the 6 days previous to the Sabbath, what was made on that day, how the firmament was made, how the lights were made, and then how the great lights, the sun for day and the moon for night, the greater light and the lesser light, and the stars in the heavens. And then how the fish of the sea and the birds of the air were created. And then how the herbs and all the greenery and all the trees and so forth, how that was created. Then on the sixth day, the beasts of the field and human beings were created on the sixth day. It says in verse 1 of chapter 2, he says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." Everything in the heavens and the earth was finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done. It says on the seventh day he ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Everything that he had made, he rested from, but he still made one thing. He stopped making things, and he made one more thing. Verse 3, "Then God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it." He made it holy, which is what sanctified means. He made it a sacred day. Because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. On the seventh day, he still made something, he just rested in doing it, and that's what made the day, and he blessed it and pronounced it holy, sacred, sanctified, set apart. Now, there is a challenge implied in that for those people who, and there are, obviously I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are many people who feel that the Sabbath has been done away with. That it's just we should keep one day in 7 holy. I get a little, it's almost gets under your skin just a little bit when you read the commentaries and they mention, well, this was, back in the day, this was the day they rested on, but now in Christianity we have another day that we rest on, and we keep it to a degree. They do. They don't usually. A lot of people might go to church in the morning and in the afternoon mow the lawn or whatever it is they want to do. But nonetheless, it's not really specified by the commentaries how this all happened. They just sort of gloss over it. We're supposed to keep one day in 7 holy. Some people don't even go that far. But the challenge here is, if God rested, if God sanctified this day, blessed it and made it holy, set it apart, when did that day ever in the entire history of the Bible, where do we find that it was unsanctified, that blessing was taken away, and that it was no longer hallowed or dedicated for holy use? They could take up that challenge, but they would lose because they won't find it in the Bible. Now, they make up some excuses and so forth about it, but it's not found in the Bible. It's just innuendo and so forth of things that they might think they see in there, but it's not really there. This day was set apart at creation. It was blessed. It was sanctified, and it's still that way today. It still is that way today. It is holy time. Malachi, the 3rd chapter, and also Hebrews 13 says about God, I change not. In Malachi says, I change not. In Hebrews says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. There's no change. Mark says that this day records the words of Christ, that the Sabbath was made for man. It was created, that it was made for man. It didn't just happen, somebody didn't just pick it, but it was created. It was made for man, Mark 2:27. But let's go back to the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20th chapter. Exodus 20. And in Exodus 20, we have the first 3 about God, the first 3 commandments about God, and so, of course, is also the 4th commandment. It says in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So at this point, which is way down the road from creation, quite a long time down the road from creation, at this time, it still was holy. And they were told to remember it, to keep it holy. Now people say, well, why didn't this was just given to the Israelites? But God does things in a setting. He does things so that we can understand it. He does it in examples and in a setting. And the Israelites were actually supposed to take these days, and they were supposed to show these commandments, actually the whole set of commandments, as well as the other instructions they got, and show the nations around them how God's way was supposed to work. They were supposed to be an example, and that's why God gave it to them, because he made a covenant with them that they would do these things. And part of that covenant was that they were to be an example to the nations around them. Of course, we know how that worked out. They failed at it, and lest we think we're that much better, we also fail a lot of times in keeping our covenant with God, unfortunately, but we continue to work at it, and with Christ, with God's Spirit, we can become better at it, and we grow. But he says, remember the Sabbath day, in verse 8, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. It's the Sabbath of the Lord, your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son nor your daughter, your male servant, female servant, even your cattle are supposed to be able to rest, and the stranger who is within your gates. In other words, people living among you, if they're part of your particular group, they're supposed to rest also. And why would that be? Well, he said, in verse 11, he says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." He made it holy, as we've already mentioned. He made it holy for people to keep holy. We're supposed to remember to keep it holy. In Hebrews, the 4th chapter, if you want to turn there real quick, Hebrew 4. Hebrews, the 4th chapter. Most people feel that, and it's probably so, that Paul wrote Hebrews, and there's some internal evidence to that effect, but no author is given anywhere. But Hebrews, the 4th chapter, which is now way down in the New Testament, it's many years after Christ was crucified, after he made the sacrifice for us. And in 4th chapter, in verse 4, he says, the writer, he spoke, he being God, spoke in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Now most, or a lot of places, not all places, but a lot of places where it speaks about the Sabbath in the Bible, in a lot of places it refers right back to the creation, to that seventh day rest that God did, to the seventh day. Then dropping down to verse 9, it says, "There remains therefore a rest for the people of God." There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. Now these two words rest, the one in chapter or verse 4 and the one in verse 9, are two different words. They're not the same word. The one in verse 4 means to be at rest or to settle down, to stop what you're doing, basically. But the one in the rest in verse 9 means keeping of Sabbath. Keeping of Sabbath. Therefore, or there remains, therefore, a keeping of Sabbath for the people of God. And that's what the word means. You can look it up. It's 4520 in Strong's. The number for it, rather, the Greek number, 4520. And it means a keeping of Sabbath. There remains, therefore, a keeping of Sabbath. God rested, we rest. And that's the first thing we want to look at, and that is rest. There is a strange thing about rest. I was reading an article in a magazine that I have. It's a magazine called Farming Magazine, and of all places for this article to be. But it was a good, very good article. And the article was titled Work. It just was simply called Work. And it was by, I think, Jonas Schlabach, I think was the guy's name. But he said, and rightfully so, work is a gift from God. It helps us to appreciate our God-given day of rest. Work is a gift from God, but so is rest. Rest is also a gift from God, and work helps us to appreciate it. As it said in Exodus 20, 6 days you shall work, and the seventh day, just like God did, we are to rest. Quite a few years ago, I used to get my hair cut in a small little country town at the local barber shop there. And there was, all the locals got their hair cut there, or almost all of them. And there was I think there were 2 barber chairs, maybe 3. and the barbers were back there. And right in front of them was a bench. Well, every day, and everybody around knew this fella. One of the local, sort of a ne'er-do-well, would come in and he'd sit on the bench and he'd talk to the people there. He was sort of averse to work. He didn't particularly care to work. He thought that work was, I guess, a bad word. But anyway, he'd sit there and he'd talk to the barbers, or he'd talk to all the people that came in, because he knew most of them. Most of all of us knew him. And one day, he's sitting there like he did every day, pretty much. He'd come at a certain point and stay there all day. He didn't, as I mentioned, do any work. And he stretched and he yawned, and he said, he says, I have to go home because tomorrow, and rest, he said, because tomorrow I have to go fishing. And I was thinking to myself, how can you rest if you've never done anything? Now, I understand there are a lot of people who cannot work. It comes to that point where you retire and where your life's work is your physical work may be sort of at an end, and it's time to enjoy a more relaxed time in your life because you've sort of done your job. You've sort of done all the damage you're going to do in life in terms of work, where work's concerned. But that was not the case in this fellow's life. But that's sort of how it goes. If we don't work, then how in the world are we going to be able to rest? If we never worked a day in our life, how could we ever enjoy or appreciate rest? God worked, we worked. God rested, we worked. Or we rest, rather. We probably do not appreciate the day of rest like the people God was speaking to in the Ten Commandments. Here was a people who had come out of 400 years or something thereabouts of slavery, probably some less than that, because the first little while they weren't necessarily slaves. But they had come out of slavery, where they worked from, as they say, from can to can, from sun up to sundown, till they couldn't work anymore, and probably did not have a day that they could rest, that they could just take off. So to hear that you are to take one day out of 7 and sit down and rest and quit working and do something else was probably music to their ears. I just recently, in just a tiny little way, I sort of got reminded of that. This spring, like it's doing now, it's been raining all the time, and we planted our garden, and it came up a little bit, but we couldn't get in it to do any work. So the time came when finally there were a couple days of sunshine, and it dried off a little bit, and finally we were able to get in the garden. And my wife had more of this than I did, but I got enough of it to be reminded. Went in there and I worked for a little while, and I appreciated being able to quit working, go in the house and sit down. But unlike me, they didn't have air conditioning. It was just as hot in their house, or maybe hotter than it was outside. So rest was greatly, greatly appreciated. A lot more maybe than we do. But we shouldn't let that deter us. We should still look at rest as a blessing and a benefit. It does rejuvenate your body when you work and then rest, work and then rest. The Sabbath looks back to creation, and it looks forward to that rest in God's kingdom when that comes. The next thing that was talked about in Leviticus 23 and in other places as well, but specifically in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. And you can turn there if you want, back there if you want. I'll read it again. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. It is a holy convocation. Now, what does that mean? A holy convocation means that it is a sacred assembly. It is a sacred assembly, and we are asked to convene, or convoke, I guess it is. We are asked to get together, to assemble, to come before God together as His people. we are asked to make the effort to get together as his assembly rather. There is something about people, numbers of people, and strength in numbers that you cannot get by yourself. You cannot get by just being at home. So God told us to get together. We are to get together so that we can strengthen each other, so that we can encourage each other, so that we can help each other. Maybe when I come, maybe I need encouragement. Maybe I need the strength that everybody that's assembling here or with us, wherever we assemble, that maybe I need the encouragement, or maybe I can be an encourager. Maybe I need to share what I know with others of the like mind so that others can be encouraged. In Hebrews, the 10th chapter, it brings this out. Hebrews, the 10th chapter. Hebrews 10, and just two verses that we'll look at. It's 24 and 25. About getting together and assembling. This is a holy convocation, a sacred assembly. And verse 24 says, "Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." The day being that end day, the end of the age. Or maybe it would be, in our case, maybe we won't make it in our life to the end of the age, so maybe it's just when our day comes. But again, he says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. He says, let's consider in verse 24 one another in order to stir up love and good works. If we don't get together, we will not know what each other needs. And others will not know what I need. There is a strength in getting together, a synergy that is much more than one person by themselves. I've always thought and felt like maybe it just seemed like when more of God's people get together, that there is more of God's Spirit in one place. And I think that's encouraging, and I think that's strengthening. That's why it always seems like at the feast, as you go along at the Feast of Tabernacles, when bigger groups of people are getting together, that it even seems stronger than it is on a week-to-week basis, because more people have gotten together. And I think that's very, very encouraging, and God tells us to get together so that we can help each other and strengthen each other. We are families. We'll look just a little bit at Ephesians, the 5th chapter. Ephesians 5. It just gives a description. It's a fairly somewhat lengthy section, and we won't look at all of it, but it starts back in maybe verse 20 or so. It says, "Giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." And what I'm getting at is that we are family. Submitting to one another in the fear of God. Now it describes now the physical family. It says, verse 22, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." Drops down in verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." But as we go through this, just think about the assembly, the church we call it, but it's really, it is our services. The church is also included in this, but it's not, the whole church is not here. This is an assembly or a congregation, a congregating of like-minded people, of people that God has called together. Verse 25 again, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word, We are members, it says in verse 30, of his body and of his flesh and of his bones. We're all part of the body. In our case, we're part of the body of the church. And we need to get together so that we can all work together and so that it's easier for us to be encouraged to stir up the love and good works. So that we don't get to do it. When I come to the Sabbath services, invariably, even when I'm not feeling good, or if I'm not feeling good, when I leave, I feel better because I saw everybody. I could look people in the eye and see that they're doing well, or I could look people in the eye and see maybe that they're not doing so well. When we are able to look each other in the eye and talk to each other, our prayers become much more passionate and compassionate. When we see how others are hurting, and when others are not able to be here, we miss them. We want them to be here, and we feel for them. But when we can see them and talk to them, whether that's here at church or visiting them or whatever, it helps us to be more passionate and have more compassion for them. But to conclude this, in verse 32, after he'd gone through all this, Paul had, it says in verse 32, "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." We're a family. Our physical families are the same way. We had I don't know how many, we always are trying to figure out how many years we've had this family reunion. We had it on July the 4th, and it's well over 50 because I remember in 1969, which was 50 years ago, we had it at Troyer's Hollow, which was then called something else, the Dowdy. And that night, we just had an event there. Some of you were there. But that night in 1969, they had the great flood of 1969 where the Dowdy, or Troyer's Hollow, practically washed away. They had to rebuild it and so on and so forth. But I know we've been doing it longer than that because that was one of our 4th of July reunions. But as our family, at that point, our family seemed like it was stronger in a way than it is now because more of the family came. We made more of an effort. The young people so looked forward to get together and playing ball and playing with their cousins and so forth, which as the years went along, that sort of waned, and it grew a little more ho-hum, and people are not quite as diligent in trying to be there. We had a nice one this 4th of July, as I hope that you all had a nice holiday as well. Could take a day off, maybe get together with family, have cookouts and so forth, but they're getting smaller. Now, granted, a lot of the sisters and brothers that we started this with in our family have died, so that causes it to become weaker. But as families become stronger and weaker and so forth, you see the effect that it has. They no longer get together and help each other. They no longer do as much together and so forth. That's what happens to a lot of families, including ours. But I wish it wasn't so. I wish we were still meeting a lot more and knew a lot more about each other than we do now. But we do make still the effort every year. But anyway, John said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another." And it's hard to do unless we know each other, unless we are together, and unless we take the time to assemble. That's part of the reason that we are to assemble. We strengthen each other. Now, those are two things, assembling and resting, that are fairly straightforward and easy to understand, easy to know, easy to talk about, and there's not a lot of ambiguity in those two things. But there are several other things listed that we're going to talk about for just a few minutes that are a lot more, should I say, nuanced. They're a lot more dependent on us making decisions than even assembly and rest, which we also have to make the decision and make the commitment to doing. But these are even more, there's a little more ambiguity in these. And they're found in Isaiah, the 58th chapter. Isaiah was one of the writing prophets, which there were a number of them, and he had a fairly long career. I think, what was it, somewhere 30, 40 years, I think, of being a prophet, and he wrote many things as God gave him information, as God inspired him, and so forth. But in verse 13 of chapter 58 of Isaiah, there are some things listed here that we also need to consider. Verse 13, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight. And we'll just pause a moment there to think about that for a second. Is the joy, or the Sabbath, a joy and a delight for us? Do we look forward to? It indicates here that we should. It's an attitude that we need to get into. It's an attitude that we need to cultivate, strengthen. And it's an attitude that we should have, joy and delight in God's Sabbath. And the holy, going on in the same verse, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him. And then it mentions three specific things that we are to do. The first one is not doing our own ways. Not doing our own ways. These are important instructions that we need to consider in keeping the Sabbath holy, the overlooked holy day, to keeping it holy. And that can be difficult, especially in today's hectic society and hectic world. Here we are. We run 6 days a week. Then all of a sudden we stop. And it's not that easy. It's not so easy to do. That can be pretty difficult. I know in my own case, I'll give you a little example from my experience. We used to, for work, we used to have our sales meetings on Friday afternoons, and we'd all gather in the office. We had maybe half a dozen salespeople. They'd come in, and we'd have the owner of the company and a couple other people giving presentations and reports and updates and all those things. It was part sales meeting reporting, and part of it was motivational sort of speaking or motivational intentions. Well, I'd get in my car, and in the wintertime, as you know, the Sabbath can get down to as early as 5 o'clock. So I'd hustle home. I'd get out of the sales meeting, and I'd take off for home, try to get there, which I usually did just a few minutes before the Sabbath was over. But it's difficult when you're all charged up to all of a sudden transitioning from that to holy time. From that to keeping the Sabbath holy. Because your mind's racing at full speed. And then all of a sudden, on a dime, you want to pivot and go in another direction. Well, that can be difficult to do. I learned over the years to, as I'm going home and as I'm taking that time, I learned to sort of decompress and sort of transition on the way to the Sabbath. So that when the Sabbath came, I was more prepared to think in Sabbath mode. But that was not always the case. It took time. It takes time and effort to try to work those things out because it's not human nature. Our nature is to do what we want to do, our own way. We will turn back to Numbers 15, and we'll see an extreme example of this and the consequences of it in this particular society and in this particular circumstance, and it's about the man gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Now, at this point, they were out in the wilderness, and they had already gone. They already had agreed to not work on the Sabbath. They had agreed to a lot of the things that God had told them, and so forth. This was not blind knowledge, something he didn't know. But we'll just see in verse 30. That the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, and what that means, presumptuously means defiantly. The person who does anything defiantly, presumptuously, whether he is native or a stranger, he brings reproach on the Lord. Then going on to verse 32. It says, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man out there gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Well, you could say, well, maybe it was cold and he needed something for a fire, or maybe it was he didn't have anything to build a fire to heat and cook his food, or whatever you want to rationalize it with. But nonetheless, here was a man who could have prepared in advance for this. But he didn't. He was doing his own way. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. Now, I'm bringing this up because I want to, oftentimes when you read in the Old Testament, you read through the law, the first 5 books, you will find that a lot of things might seem extreme to us, but it also points out the importance of it to God, the importance of it to the lives of those around him and to God. It says they put him under guard, verse 34, because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So we can see that it was very important. It was very critical. They were supposed to be examples of how to keep the Sabbath. They were not supposed to be doing certain things on the Sabbath. They had already agreed. They had ratified the covenant. They had already agreed that they were not going to do that. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai and read the 10 Commandments to him, they said, we will agree to do this. We will do it. Yep, we will do it. But, again, sometimes those things wear off a little bit, as they did in this case. Not doing our own ways. It is sometimes hard to do because we have things that we want to do. We have things that we'd like to do, things that seem important to us. But God made 6 days to work and 1 day to not work. But we have to make the choice to not do our own way. Nobody else can. We have to do that personally. Going on and I could have told you to keep your finger in Isaiah 58, but you found your way there once, so I'm sure you can find it again. Isaiah 58, and in verse 13, continuing to the next thing. It says, not finding your own pleasure. That's another thing that's sometimes tough, because we all have things that we like to do, pleasures, if you will. And what about if the Indians, they're finally in the playoffs again, and that 7th game, the last game, is on the Sabbath. Now what are we going to do? Are we going to do our own pleasure, or maybe God will overlook it? Maybe it's just this one time. Maybe God will overlook it, and maybe we could just ask forgiveness from God and go ahead and do it, or the point is, we have to make a decision. Are we going to do that, or we say, no, God said not doing your own pleasure, I better not do that. It extends much more than sports. It extends to our favorite TV shows. Sometimes that final episode is on the Sabbath. It's in the summertime, and the Sabbath is not over till almost 9 o'clock. And this show starts at 8. It's close, we're close, so maybe that's not such a big deal. Maybe we can just go ahead and do it anyway. Recently, and I never watched it, but a lot of people did, there was the big to do was about Game of Thrones. And I don't know much about it, but I know people just couldn't miss that particular final episode. They had to see it. I don't think it was on the Sabbath. It might have been, but nonetheless, something like that. And now it's like eating all your food, and then here's the dessert, but you can't have it. It's sort of how some of those things are. We can't, we have to make a decision. We're faced with a decision. We're faced, and it's up to us to decide. Now, we need to get input. If we have questions, we need to get input from other people and to see what they've experienced, how they have handled it, and so on and so forth. But when it comes right down to where the rubber hits the road, we are responsible for making the decision as to what we're going to do. And I know in the last 10, 15, 20 years, I've changed a lot of things because I've learned that maybe I should not be doing those things on the Sabbath. We all come to those conclusions, and we all get to that thing. Maybe that auction, the house down the street, looks like a really great deal, and we think we can get it for cheap, but it's on the Sabbath. And most good auctions are on the Sabbath, so we're not able to go. There's thousands of things that we face in that light, in that line. Luke, the 8th chapter, we've actually had, in a couple of sermons, we've heard about some of this in the last month or so. Luke, the 8th chapter. And music, for example, is another one of those things. But Luke 8, and we're not going to, it's the parable of the sowers. We know that some of the soil, when the farmer was sowing it in his field, some of the seed fell on rocky places. Some fell by the wayside. Some fell on good soil, but some fell among the thorns. Verse 7. And as he was sowing, some fell among the thorns of the seed. It was good seed. And the thorns sprang up with it, and they choked it. Now, like probably we are at times, we wonder, what in the world does that mean? We know how that works, but what's it mean in life? So the disciples didn't quite understand it, so they asked Jesus Christ to explain it. And in verse 14, he did. It says, now the ones that fell among the thorns are those who, when they have heard, they go out and they are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and they bring no fruit to maturity. It is so easy to happen to let ourselves get sidetracked with what we want, with our pleasures, with those things that we would like to do and that we think are so important at times. And that's another lesson I learned, that things that seemed so important way back then just aren't that important anymore, because I've sort of gotten over that and passed, and probably other things now that are the same way are not that important either. But anyway, the thorns choked out they go out and are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures, and they don't produce. They don't bear fruit because they've allowed themselves to be choked out. And now, instead of bearing fruit, they're barren. Going back to Isaiah, the 59th chapter, or 58th chapter, I'm sorry. We have the last one to look at. In Isaiah, the 58th chapter, and again, that same verse, Isaiah 58 and verse 13, and there's a third thing, and this may be, in one sense, almost the hardest of all for us to consider and try to implement or try to understand in our life. And that is not speaking our own words on the Sabbath. Now, when we think about that, it takes us some time to wrap our minds around that and find out or think about what could that possibly mean, not speaking our own words. There are a number of things that it could be, but it does ask us to make a choice and a decision about what we're going to talk about on the Sabbath. I mean, we talk about a lot of things. We want to find out how the welfare of our fellow brethren, how they're doing, and so forth. And to do that, sometimes we get into areas that are not necessarily based on Scripture per se, but we're trying to gauge what's happening in other people's lives. But there again, we have to make a choice. There are some things that are probably not appropriate to talk about on the Sabbath. But, again, we have to determine that for ourselves. Not that we determine it for ourselves. God gives us guidelines. If we're like the Bereans and we are constantly studying the Word to find out what the Word of God says, little by little we will come to those conclusions, because no, we're not to just make our own decisions on what's right or wrong. That's not the point. But we do have to make a decision as to whether we're going to obey it or how we're going to apply some of these things. As I mentioned when I started reading this section, these are tougher and harder things to apply, because they're not as defined as saying you're supposed to get together. You're supposed to rest and stop working. These have more possible, they reach deeper into our life and into our mind and into our heart than some of those other things do. So we have to determine what that means to us individually. But we want to be careful that we make the right choices about what we talk about and what the gist of our conversations are on the Sabbath day, because God expects that from us. And it's not up to us necessarily. When I say us, it's not up to the church to dictate and say you can't talk about this or you can't talk. It's not that. It's for us to learn what we can talk about on the Sabbath when we're together. It's up to us to decide, you know what, maybe I should no longer talk about those things. Maybe, and we get to that point. All of us do as we grow and learn. In Deuteronomy, I do know this one thing. In Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, Deuteronomy 6, there is this is a section that always is, this is one of my favorites, one of my favorite sections of Scripture. Deuteronomy 6, and we can apply this to this particular Scripture, not speaking your own words. In verse 4 he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Jesus Christ repeated this, and I think it's Matthew and Mark, or Matthew and Luke. In Luke, I think it's in chapter 22, maybe around verse 37, that he repeated this when he and verified this when he said that this is to the young man who said, "What is the greatest commandment?" He said, "This one is the greatest commandment, and the second is like unto him, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." But anyway, you're to love your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your strength. "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart." We're supposed to internalize these words that God has given. And here he talks about how that happens. Verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." When we sit, when we stand, when we walk, and when we rise up. Other than that, we can talk about what we want, other than those 4 occasions. But that pretty much leaves us thinking about and talking about God's way most of the time. So you shall teach them diligently to your children. Now that could be babes in Christ, in our case. Maybe we can teach others, or maybe others can teach us in these situations when we talk about them. And certainly we should be trying to teach our children these things. We should try to bring them up in the admonition of the Lord. In verse 6, you shall bind them or 8 rather, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. When I look at that, I'm always thinking they're supposed to be on our hand and as frontlets between our eyes. It's like the opposite of the mark of the beast, which is also a mark on our forehead and a mark in our hand. But this is God's mark, and we certainly want to be part of God's setting apart and setting aside. But these are things that we can talk about. These are things that we are free to talk about at length in church or in services or at other places and at other times as well. But did you notice what he said in verse 6? These words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Because in Matthew 12 and in Luke 6 we find that out of the abundance of the heart, we won't turn there, but out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What's in our heart will eventually come out. And we want the right things in our heart, which he talks about here. We want to be able to have things to talk about that please God. God's words. The Sabbath is for speaking God's words. We can be a good example, or we can follow a good example, and we should do both. We should follow good examples, and we should be good examples to each other. That's why we are supposed to assemble. The overlooked holy day, the Sabbath, is also a feast. We are to take joy in the feast, in this day. It is a day of rest. We know that. It's a day to quit doing what we normally do 6 days a week and rest. It's a day to stop, as God did from his work, and rest. To take it easy. And we can be refreshed by doing that. It's a day of assembly. It's a day to gather together with folks of like mind, with those of us who have been called into this assembly, or God's church at large. It's a time to get together and to stir each other up to love and good works. And we should do that all the more as that day approaches. It's a day of not doing our own way. It's a day of stopping doing our way, working, doing whatever we do, and focus on God. Focus on God's way. Focus on God's church, on his family as we gather together. It's a day of not finding our own pleasure, not doing the things that we might do on every other day that bring us joy and happiness and so forth. We're supposed to be delighting and have joy in the Sabbath, and that's supposed to be our pleasure on the Sabbath day. It's a day of not speaking our own words. I know that covers a lot, not speaking our own words, and it's difficult to do at times, but that's what we need to focus on more and more all the time. Being more focused on God and speaking his words, and that will come from the heart as we internalize God's way, as we hide his words and his way in our heart, as we concentrate on doing God's way, as we concentrate on learning God's way and not speaking our own words or doing our own way. These are just a few of the many things that we need to do or can do to keep God's Sabbath keep this day holy. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And I haven't even mentioned probably the number one reason for the Sabbath and the number one thing that we are to do, and that is to worship God. But reading Isaiah 58:13 again. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him not doing your own ways, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you, verse 14, to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken it. We'll look at one last scripture in John 4. John chapter 4. And some of you might remember this is Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, which, generally speaking, the Jews and Samaritans did not have a lot to do with each other because they were sort of at odds with each other. The Jews looked at the Samaritans as imposters. They had supplanted the Israelites, the house of Israel, in the land of what had become Samaria, and had learned some of their ways, but not all of them. But anyway, in verse 23 and in verse 24 is what we're going to look at. He's talking to this Samaritan woman, and he says, the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. The Sabbath is truth. The Sabbath is part of the truth. It's a big part of it. And obedience to God is a big part of the true worship of God. Obedience, obeisance to God is worshiping God. When we keep the Sabbath holy, we are worshiping God.